All right, so other doctrinal developments. We've already highlighted the rise of liberal Protestantism, but there's an important development doctrinally that we didn't talk about, and I want to talk about now. Higher criticism is a key component of liberal Protestantism. In the middle of the 19th century, a school of thought developed in Germany that essentially applied evolutionary thinking to the biblical text. So if human beings evolved over time, they assumed that the biblical text evolved over time. Meaning that it had been edited, it had been compiled, in opposition to traditional beliefs of one author being guided by the Spirit to produce documents. Now, previous generations had seen individuals that were critical of the text. Erasmus, for example, right, turned a critical eye to manuscripts to try and find the original text of Scripture, what's known as textual criticism. But beginning in the 18th century and moving on, there was an additional push for critical approaches to the biblical text. You have the rise of biblical archaeology to confirm the events of the Bible. But there's this question of, did the text evolve? This supposition of the evolution of biblical text became known as higher criticism. Scholars, particularly in Germany, sought to identify the sources of biblical documents, whether in ancient Near East materials or in the construction of the biblical text itself. So things like the documentary hypothesis developed, which was a supposition that 4 distinct documents had been melded together to give us the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. Now they based this off of different usages of the names of God, right? Yahweh, Elohim, supposed differences in theologies of different parts of the Pentateuch. They believed that they could find regional emphases, right? That there were some texts that supported the northern kingdom, the later northern kingdom, and some texts that supported the southern kingdom, so that must have been written after the northern and southern kingdoms were in existence, several hundred years after Moses. Eventually, these approaches, this higher criticism, would make their way into English and then later American seminaries, especially by the end of the 19th century. Some liberal Protestants adopted this view of higher criticism. They're thinking that it was more scientific. Conservatives, however, denounced it and were very concerned at the time about the impact it could have on Christianity. This interest in the historical critical approach to biblical texts, as well as this kind of disdain for irrational religiosity, led for this search for reasonable truths in all aspects of religion. We could talk about developments in Judaism at the time. But it also resulted in an interest in discovering the Jesus of history, who was often, by these liberal Protestants, conceptualized as somebody different from the Christ of theology. That there was this human being, Jesus of Nazareth, who throughout time was eventually converted in the minds of Christians into the deified Christ. Interest in the life of Jesus, of course, was not a new feature. Christians from the earliest centuries were interested in the life of Christ. That's why we have Gospels. But this critical search was not interested in pursuing faith or defending traditional beliefs, but was something new. Herman Reimarus appears to be one of the first to start this historical Jesus questing. Reimarus appears to be the focus of this, and he was interested in what could be determined about what Jesus actually said and did, instead of what his followers said he said and did. And so he's supposing that there's a difference between what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John said Jesus said and did, and what Jesus actually said and did. He also emphasized the situation of Jesus in the Judaism of his time. Right? We have to understand Jesus in the context of Second Temple Judaism. The Jewish notions of the kingdom of God, focused the foundation of Jesus' teaching for Marx. Ultimately, Marx believed much of early Christianity is essentially deceptive. The apostles changed Jesus' political message to a theological one of suffering and redemption. Christianity, he said, was the invention of Jesus' followers. He even went so far as to suggest that they had stolen Jesus' body to claim a resurrection and then recreated his message. Now, when you stop and think about that critically, right, this is supposedly a critical examination of the gospel. When you critically think about that, it seems foolish in the context of first century Messianic movements. If your Messiah dies, you don't resurrect them, you find a new Messiah. Right? And so this idea that the apostles would be so stuck on Jesus after his physical death that they would create this theological message and this notion of resurrection just doesn't fit with the Judaism of the time. And it doesn't explain other things like the transfer very early to the first day of the week. The resurrection was a doctrine that they developed over time. Why did they start worshiping on the first day of the week instead of staying on the Sabbath? Right? If Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, why that sudden change? Right? So critically, this doesn't make sense. But this notion of Jesus of history must be different than the Christ of theology. Another important early thinker in all of this was a man named David Strauss. He was a philosopher and theologian, published his Life of Jesus in the 1830s. Strauss claimed that the best way to understand the Gospels was through the trope of myth. Now, these were stories with value, religious and philosophical value. And it's not about historicity, but it is about the power of the story. Now, part of what he's trying to do is circumvent skepticism and say that these documents are still valuable. Right? The big concern here is the miracles and Jesus' resurrection. In the 19th century, people believed that, well, those things can't be real. Scientifically, they can't happen. Right? But of course, miracles and resurrection by its nature are not scientific. So science cannot explain that. And so this focus on myth, that these are religious stories not meant to be understood historically. These ideas about the historical Jesus found interest, especially among the liberal theologians in Germany. Oftentimes, many of these people didn't see themselves as trying to destroy Christianity, but trying to find something that they could salvage of it to allow people to have a rational faith. For many of these liberal theologians, the Gospel of Mark was considered the primary text. It was the shortest, and many believed that because it was shorter, it was more historically reliable. They believed that the author, who was probably not named Mark for a lot of these liberal theologians, was more interested in recounting events instead of theologizing about them. So the focus in Mark, they believed, was more on the personality of Jesus. Well, discoveries and works in the early 20th century brought the first quest to somewhat of a conclusion, particularly the work of Albert Schweitzer. Schweitzer was a medical doctor who had a doctorate in philosophy, theology, was a musician as well, and in 1906 he released the Quest of the Historical Jesus in German. His main contribution to the historical Jesus search was his presentation that these so-called lives of Jesus were presented in ways that were often projections of their authors. They created a Jesus who looked very much like themselves. And so if you were a Marxist, well, surprise, surprise, don't you know Jesus happened to be Marxist as well. And so a lot of these people projected a Jesus, they thought, well, Jesus thought exactly like I thought. And so Schweitzer said, the historical Jesus quest isn't useful because all we're doing is seeing ourselves in the mirror. While the Germans were questioning dogma and doctrine and theology, Catholics were reconceptualizing it. We've mentioned before how Mary has had a prime place within Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity. We talked about the idea of Theotokos, about Mary as the God-bearer. In the 19th century, however, there was the promulgation of a new conception of Mary, specifically an immaculate conception of Mary, which we've mentioned before. The Immaculate Conception, in brief, refers to the idea that Mary was born and conceived without original sin. So the Immaculate Conception refers to Mary, not to Jesus. This was promulgated or promoted as dogma by Pius IX in 1854. Up till this time, this was the only dogma developed outside of a church council. Other doctrines, dogmas, deeply held truths were promoted out of councils. It was also not without precedent. Other people had supported this idea from the Middle Ages, but it's only made Catholic dogma in 1854 in the Constitution Ineffabilis Deus. There was a lot of support for the Immaculate Conception because there was a lot of veneration of Mary. Mary was very important. The Immaculate Conception has not been officially adopted by Anglicans, Orthodox Christians, or certainly Protestants, although even among these groups there are people who claim that Mary was without sin, or accepted the idea she was born without original sin. Of course, some groups deny the existence of original sin, and so that's not even a problem. But to kind of make sure that Jesus is born without original sin, Mary is conceived immaculately. The acceptance of this doctrine is helped along by a series of Marian apparitions in Lourdes, France. In the middle of the 1800s, a young girl, about the age of 14, named Bernadette, claims that Mary had appeared to her. She was out in the countryside, heard a noise like a gust of wind, and sees a hollow in the rock where a woman is, and identifies herself as Mary. Mary would appear 18 times to Bernadette, according to the story, and would emphasize her appearance as the Immaculate Conception. Mary would go on to ask for a chapel to be built there in Lourdes, and Bernadette is told to drink from a fountain there. And so Mary brings up a spring that is believed to be a healing spring, and the grotto there that's developed at Lourdes is still a popular pilgrimage spot. People going to this grotto, believing that the water from the spring has healing powers. The belief that children don't lie, combined with Mary's statement, "I am the Immaculate Conception," helped solidify this doctrine for many people. Another important Catholic doctrine in the 19th century was the idea of papal infallibility. In the late 1800s, Pius IX called for a worldwide council, the first one since the Council of Trent in the 1500s, known as the First Vatican Council. It grew out of the response to modernism, which is present in Quanta Cura and the Syllabus of Errors, and it's meant to counter nationalism and rationalism. The council was also looking to how to respond to new political situations that had developed, the French Revolution, for example. The council begins in Rome in 1869. Eastern Orthodox Christians and Protestants are invited to come as well, but the invitation is not worded very well, so it comes off as insulting rather than inviting. Word leaks out that one of the ideas to be presented and accepted was the doctrine of papal infallibility, which was accepted. Now, the doctrine is limited in scope. Right? It's not that the Pope does everything infallibly or anything the Pope says is infallible. The Pope is only infallible when speaking ex cathedra, from the chair or from the throne. This is not to say that the Pope is sinless or inspired by God for Catholics, and is only applicable in certain situations. He is said to be speaking infallibly when he speaks as the public and official head of the Church Universal and speaking on statements of faith or morals. And his teaching is believed to be the final word on a subject that has undergone discussion, that is intended to be binding on the whole church. Now, in previous centuries, the church had been understood as infallible in a similar way. The bodily assumption of Mary, that Mary did not die but was taken directly into heaven, appears to be the only dogma specifically promulgated under the infallibility of the Pope since Vatican I. Right? So it's used very rarely. Now, some Catholic theologians have gone back and said certain statements of previous popes have been infallible ex cathedra proclamations. But the assumption of Mary seems to be the only one where the Pope clearly thought he was infallibly speaking ex cathedra. A sizable number of American bishops, however, when this is promoted, did not vote in support of it, but eventually they will acquiesce to it. Questions about the Immaculate Conception or papal infallibility? All right, we will close there and pick up on Tuesday with practice changes. Don't forget, right,